Hi, you're watching Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone, and in this video I want to talk about Sicario 2, Day of the Soldado. Now, this is a film that I have discussed previously after I watched it for the first time. And basically, my sense after watching it first time around was that this movie, Sicario 2, was good, but it wasn't as good as the first film, that it basically paled in comparison. However, the other day I had the opportunity to go back and watch this movie again, and on second viewing, I've realized that my initial thoughts about the film were not actually on point. And in actual fact, this film, Sicario 2, Day of the Soldado, is actually a really, really good film. It's different from the first one for sure. Obviously, different director, and so you're going to have different sensibilities, especially when you're talking about first time around. You've got a guy like Denis Villeneuve who has a particular type of sensibility and a whole lot of really key strengths. This is a guy who is one of the best directors who is making film today. And so when you move away from a director like that to someone else, you are going to see differences, especially with someone who's got such a unique sort of visual sensibility and filmmaking style about him. And so I think my first viewing was very much captured perhaps by what you might call the superficial, still very important, but the superficial aspects of a film, not the story so much as the visuals and the sort of directing sensibility. And this film is definitely different in that regard. However, when you look at the story in this film, this is a profoundly important movie, and it tells a story about conscience, and in particular, the corruption of conscience, and it tells that story very, very well. Now, before I get into exploring that whole theme and why this story is so good, let me just say that this is another example of Taylor Sheridan at his finest. I think Taylor Sheridan is one of the best script writers who is writing movies today. In many ways, he's probably a writer of modern westerns. These films that he writes may not initially seem like westerns, but really they are very much in that particular vein of storytelling. And this film is, again, very much in that particular vein of storytelling. It's a modern western, for want of a better term. But just to give you an example of how well he writes his scripts, and I think why this matters so much, particularly in this day and age where we are served up so many films that are just not well written. Effectively, what we have a lot of today are movies that are more interested in the payoff than the setup. But the problem is, if you don't actually set up the payoff, when the payoff comes, it just doesn't carry the same weight, or it's a very superficial thing that's nothing more than sort of some sort of hyper-emotionalism. It's being driven by spectacle, or it's being driven by emotive music, and basically the director, the screenwriter is trying to get you to have an emotion or to have a connection with the story that they haven't actually earned because they haven't set that connection up properly. And so when the payoff arrives, it just is not, just doesn't carry that same gravitas and have that same weight that it should have in a well-written story. Taylor Sheridan and his writing is not like that. He sets things up and he sets them up really well. And a great example of that in this film, Sicario 2, this is just one little example, is that scene where we have the setup with Alejandro and Miguel Hernandez. And they're in that mall, and you remember Miguel has just been to that mall. He's out in the car park again, and Alejandro is in the car with Matt Graver, and Miguel walks out into their path without looking where he's going, and they just about hit him, and they have to slam on the brakes to avoid hitting him. And there is this moment of confrontation where they are both parties are sort of staring each other down, and this is the setup for what comes subsequent in the story when Miguel Hernandez recognizes Alejandro the second time he meets him, when Alejandro now is with Isabella Reyes and he's trying to sneak her across the border, and he's in that people smuggling operation, and that Miguel Hernandez is part of. And young Miguel sees him and recognizes him. Now, why is this so important? It's very simple, but it's really important because what Taylor Sheridan has done there is he has given us a really good justification for why Miguel Hernandez would recognize Alejandro the second time he sees him. Because under most other circumstances, if you saw someone at the mall in passing, you would not remember that person if you met them a couple of days or weeks later. in another circumstance. You just would not remember them. That's not how the human person works. However, if you have a moment like this one and the way this story is set up, where you are just about hit by a car, which is a moment filled with adrenaline and anxiety and tension, and which sticks in your mind, and then you stop and you stare down the people in that car, you are going to remember those people, and you are more likely to remember that figure of Alejandro the second time you see him, because he is associated with a moment of fear, of life or death that you've experienced only just previously, very, very recently. And so it's a really great setup. It's so simple. And when you hear it explained like that, and as I'm talking about it, you realize this is simple stuff. But what you also realize, and I realized particularly seeing this film, is that the writing of scripts today is often just so poor and so deficient, so little care is taken, that this simple stuff is just not even being done well anymore. So you get the big payoff, you get the big climax moments with very little in the way of setup. It's a real common problem today. This film is a well-written script. It's not one of those kind of movies. In a nutshell, as I said, this is a film about conscience, and in particular, the corruption of conscience, and it's really the tale of three men and their conscience. It's a trial of conscience that three men will undergo in this film. The first is Matt Graver, next is Alejandro, and third is Miguel Hernandez. And each one of them has a separate trial of conscience, and each one of them responds in different ways to that trial of conscience. Now, the first film, Sicario, is a lot more subtle around the moral philosophy, if you like, and the moral questions. Because basically what it does is it poses this question, do the ends actually justify the means? And it explores, obviously another big difference between these two films is the first film is focused very much on the idea of drugs and drug smuggling. This one is more about people smuggling and the sort of the paucity of the border and sort of some of those kind of bigger implications. However, they are still exploring the same sort of moral question. The first film takes that question, do the ends justify the means? Is it okay to respond to these very cruel, violent and callous drug dealers in kind, with your own cruelty and callousness? If you are doing this for a good end, you are trying to protect your country or keep people safe. Is it also to join in, okay to join in the cruelty and the violence and everything else without any sort of moral restraint? Now, the first film is subtle. It puts the question out there, but it doesn't answer the question. It doesn't come down strongly either way. You can watch this film and you can put yourself in the shoes of initially it seems like it's Kate Mercer versus Matt Graver, but in actual fact it's really Kate versus Alejandro. And Alejandro represents this idea of the end justifies the means, and Kate is very much someone who says, no, there must be the stability of virtue which limits our action even when we respond to grave evil. And there's that great conversation they have towards the end of the film where he basically accuses her of being someone who is totally out of her depth. She's surrounded by wolves and she just doesn't realize what is required to actually meet the threat in the situation. But the film doesn't actually, it leaves it open enough. It's a very well-made film where Denis Villeneuve basically just puts the question out there and leaves you with this question, but doesn't attempt to come down strongly either side. And it's interesting. So you get people who review this film and who are firmly of the belief that the ends don't justify the means, and they will see that in this movie. Other people who think that, well, in this case, the ends would justify the means, they will watch the film and they think the film justifies that position. That's because the film, as I said, doesn't come down strongly and condemn or make a declaration either way. The second film is much clearer in the statement that it's making. It is much clearer regarding the moral philosophy here, because it explores this whole idea of consciences that are being corrupted. And it's asking that same question again, but clearly it's pointing now in a different direction to the first film. And it's a really profoundly important message that lies at the heart of the story. The morality tale here is that if your conscience becomes corrupted by the end justifies the means, that's not a good thing. And you see this played out very clearly in this trial of conscience. Now, Alejandro is the first of our three men who undergoes this trial of conscience. And Alejandro is a guy who sort of symbolizes, in many ways, the ultimate victimization at the hands of these cartels. He's a former tax inspector and prosecutor from Juarez, Mexico, and his wife and child were brutally murdered by these cartels, and he has become an assassin as a result. He is the ultimate example of someone who has gone from being very much in the system, and not just in the system. He's not a military guy. He's not a special forces guy. This is a guy who's like effectively almost like a bureaucrat. He's a guy who's got a desk job or an office job, and because of the victimization that he's experienced and the presence of evil from these cartels that has touched his life so profoundly and so personally, he has shifted and become an agent of revenge. He is an assassin. He is now, he's done a complete 180 in his life, not just the fact that he's now so far outside the norms of the system, but also the fact that he's doing things that he was not doing before. I think in some ways, if his character had been like a soldier, I guess kind of like the Punisher, the character of the fictional character of the Punisher is someone who you kind of think, it makes sense that someone like that would actually would become that particular character. But for someone like Alejandro to shift in the way that he has is really quite profound when you think about it. And so he is very much driven by this idea of the end justify the means. All he can see is it's not even really, when you look at his character, it's not about justice. It is about this sort of blind and sort of insatiable and unquenchable thirst, if you like, for vengeance. And what happens in this movie, though, is he encounters the character of Isabel Reyes. And Isabel Reyes is really the spark for him that ignites his conscience again. And you see this very powerfully illustrated in the lead up when they're in that vehicle, they're with that convoy just before the convoy is attacked. And you can see that the wheels of his conscience are beginning to spin again as he's seeing this young girl and he's in the situation with her. And obviously, what we discover as the movie ensues is that basically he's being reminded, really, if you look back on it, you realize he's being reminded of his own daughter and his own family, and this is bringing his conscience back to life again. And then we see this powerfully illustrated, the way in which his conscience really becomes enlivened and he begins to shift his position. We see this so very powerfully and clearly laid out after the convoy is attacked, when he has to walk Isabel Reyes to safety, and he encounters that deaf couple. And it's so interesting that the symbolism in this film is really quite powerful, and it's very easy to miss the first time around. And you go back and you watch it subsequently, and on subsequent viewings you see things that perhaps you missed the first time around. So as he's walking her to safety, he encounters that deaf couple, and it's an interesting script writing decision, because it could be tempting at first to when you see that scene and that whole experience he has, to sort of think, that was an odd choice, why do that? But then you realize, the more you think about it, what Taylor Sheridan is trying to illustrate to us here, I think, is this idea that this couple represent the old world, the former life, the more civilized and virtuous world that Alejandro used to inhabit. And that world, through that couple, is now calling to him again. It's that whole thing of his daughter who was deaf, and who he very much, this couple symbolize his former life. And they are calling to him. It's a call, even if it's not overt. They're not morally challenging him, but their mere presence and its reminder, and it's the fact that it is a sign and a symbol of what his former life used to be, is a challenge in and of itself to his conscience. He is reminded of his daughter. He is reminded of his former life, the man that he used to be. And you see this conversion really come to fruition with that family, actually, on that property with that couple, where he buries his weapons. It's such a powerful piece of symbolism. And in fact, it's very what you might call baptismal symbolism and baptismal imagery. It may not seem like it because there's no water involved, But what he does is he digs a pit in the ground, and then he sheds his former clothing and his weaponry. Remember, he's wearing all that black gear, which is quite a powerful symbolism in and of itself. Black is the color of what? Of darkness. And that very much symbolizes who he is. He is a man now who has lost his soul. He has no conscience. He is operating in the darkness. And the clothing he wears, this pitch black clothing, is symbolic of that. But what does he do on this property with this couple who are the symbol of his former life? He begins to rediscover himself, and he sheds that clothing. He sheds most of his weaponry. And what does he do? He buries it in a pit in the ground. This is a moment of transformation. This is symbolic of transformation. He takes off his old garments and he puts on new garments. And this is very what you would call baptismal imagery, because in the Judeo-Christian tradition, when a person is baptized, they would wear a white garment to symbolize this whole idea of being washed clean, of being spotless. And the white garment is put on to symbolize that washing. And that's very much what happens here. He takes off his old dark clothes that are associated with this life of darkness and this soullessness and this lack of conscience. He buries them in the ground, which again is baptismal, because the whole idea of baptism is that the imagery of going down into the water and then coming out of the water is not just imagery about being cleansed, it's also symbolic of this idea of going down into the tomb, into the pit, into the grave, and being risen again, being brought out into new life. And that's exactly what's happening for Alejandro. And then what does he do? He puts on the clothing that he gets from that couple. And that deaf couple, who are his former life, basically this is profound symbolism of transformation. He is now starting to put on the garments of his former life again, his former life of conscience, his former life where virtue was actually something important to him and which governed who he was and how he acted. This is like a moment of conversion where he is rejecting that former path of evil and he's choosing something new and different now. The end is not a good enough justification for the means in this moment. You see this very clearly with this whole way in which this relationship with Isabella Reyes is sort of unfolding. And funnily enough, she is the spark for Matt Graver as well. She's quite an important character and figure in this regard, in this movie, in the symbolism of what's going on here. And then we have that moment where he is shot and killed, quote unquote. And basically it is a moment of death and resurrection, because obviously he rises from the dead, quote unquote, because obviously we know he's not really dead. But it's so powerful, the symbolism of that, of those scenes and what happens to him, that clearly there's this idea of death and resurrection played out in a way that you don't often see in a film. So first of all, you'll notice that he's killed and effectively is an environment that's kind of tomb-like. It's kind of like a grave. He's effectively in a pit. And there's that sort of high wall around them. There's vehicles on top of it with their lights shining down. He's right down in the pit when he is killed. Basically, there's a hill there, which is symbolic of the hill of Calvary. It's a tomb. He's in the ground. He's left in that tomb. And then what happens? The sun rises and he is resurrected. It's very, very powerful symbolism. And the way that all unfolds is so fundamentally important to who his character is. It will be interesting to see how this plays out going forward, because there is this ambiguity at the end of the film when we see Alejandro again at the very end with Miguel Hernandez, who and what he has now become. Is he now still an agent of the US government? Is he now changed and transformed? Is he now a man of the light? Or has he slipped back into his old ways where the end justify the means? We don't quite know. It's not clear what's going on, and I think we're going to find out in Sicario 3. But it's such a fascinating proposition, and I'm really looking forward to actually discovering what has happened to this character. But it's clear from this film that there has been this moment of transformation. He's not the same character anymore, and his conscience has been pricked, it has been enlivened, and it's been transformed by the experiences that he has had. Next we have Miguel Hernandez. And Miguel Hernandez is this young man who, his character, interestingly enough, his conscience is being, effectively, his conscience is being corrupted. It's being shaped and formed in a way that is not good by older, supposedly wiser, but more influential figures who are basically, there's one figure in particular who is really corrupting in his influence and is pulling him into the darkness of a world without virtue, a world where the end justifies the means, and it's the world of the cartels and all of the violence and the bloodshed that they are willing to perpetrate in their daily business, the operations of being part of this criminal enterprise. And the spark for him that really pricks his conscience is Alejandro. Alejandro, and you see this in particular in the moment where he betrays Alejandro. In many ways, you could say that Miguel Hernandez is he's almost like the Apostle Peter in the Christian story in the Gospels. He betrays the Messiah, but unlike Judas, who falls into despair and hangs himself, there's a different ending. The Messiah comes back to visit Miguel, to visit Peter, and Peter has a moment of repentance and conversion for his actions. And you see that in this film where, at the very end, Alejandro returns to revisit Miguel Hernandez and give him another chance to effectively put right and to change the path that he's on. But the moment where we see this betrayal really unfold is obviously Miguel Hernandez is part of that people smuggling operation, and he recognizes Alejandro, who's there with Isabella Reyes trying to sneak her across the border. And remember the setup I talked about? That setup was so very important for that scene, and it makes so much sense why he would recognize him. And then we have that moment where he gets onto the bus, and this is where the betrayal unfolds on that bus. And Alejandro is forced to surrender his weapon and is captured by these people smugglers. And you see in the look on his face, you begin to see there the realization that Miguel Hernandez has. It's quite a powerful little thing. It's all in the eyes and in the facial expressions that you can see he's beginning to have sort of an awakening of sorts, a realization that he might have done the wrong thing here by betraying Isabel and Alejandro, that he might have actually made a mistake. And you see the inklings of his conscience sort of starting to come alive here. Then we have that scene subsequently where he is asked to shoot and kill Alejandro. And he's put into this situation where he really has no choice, because the first young man who was handed the pistol and told to shoot and kill Alejandro, his conscience has not been corrupted, and so he refuses to do it. He can't do it. And so what do? They kill this kid. They kill the cartel guys, kill that young man because he refuses to kill another person who he doesn't know, who is gagged, who's bound, who's got a hood on in front of him. And so they shoot and kill him. Now, this whole idea of killing children is quite important, and it's a really important plot point. This moment is actually quite important to the overall story of this film and this whole question of conscience and who are the good guys and who are the bad guys in this story. But Miguel Hernandez finds himself in this situation where he's now in a no-win situation. He's seen the previous young man who was asked to do the same thing that he's just been asked to do. Because he refused to do it, was shot and killed. So he's handed the gun. He's told, kill Alejandro. He stares at him. It's not something he does easily. He pulls the trigger. He shoots him through the mouth, which obviously initially seems like they've killed him, but in actual fact he hasn't. This is it's not just important for the whole theme of death and resurrection, but it also sort of points to the fact that he's not a brutal, soulless killer who knows what he's doing. He's very much an amateur, and that's a good thing, because it means that his conscience has not been so dulled that he can kill a man and has no qualms about it and knows how to do that really, really well. He doesn't understand this world. It's not his world. And then what happens is Alejandro is now dead, quote unquote. He's lying on the ground, and Miguel just remains there staring at him. He doesn't walk away with this soulless lack of emotion and conviction about what he's done. He is convicted. His conscience is now troubled. Not only does he stay there staring at him, but he is the last to leave that scene beside that dead body. He is the last person. If you watch it again, you'll see he's the last person who walks away and gets onto the trucks, the pickup trucks, as they leave. He is captured by this moment. It is a moment where he is convicted in his conscience about what he has just done. And that we see this really come to fruition not long after that, where as they're driving off and you see them, they go over the light is starting to dawn. As they go over those couple of little hills, they slow down and he jumps off the back of the pickup truck. He exits the pickup truck and he chooses another path. He knows that this is not good. He's done a wrong thing and he chooses a different path. He does not want to be party to what these men are doing, and so he leaves them. But here's the interesting thing, and this is so very important, and one of the reasons why I really love this film is because it sort of gets to the complexity of how moral conscience actually works in the real world, because we see Miguel Hernandez 1 year later at the end of the film, and what do we see? He has not really chosen a different path at all. He has, in fact, been corrupted, and in a major way. He is now wearing completely different clothing. His again, remember the whole idea of clothing as symbolism? He's now wearing very different clothing, and not only that, but he's covered in tattoos. What are tattoos? Tattoos are a form of scarring. They are an external marking and an external scarring that are symbolic of an internal scarring and an internal marking of his conscience that has happened. He is no longer the same man. He has been transformed, and you see very much, it's so well done, the way he looks, and with those tattoos, his whole look, very much there is a darkness about him now that he did not have before. His childhood innocence has been robbed. It is gone. And he has been transformed. He has been corrupted. Those tattoos, the clothing, it is symbolic. He's been corrupted and he is enslaved now to this lifestyle. Now, why is this so important? Because this points to the fact that to live a good moral life, it's not just a matter of doing one good thing and then you're done. So when he jumps off the back of that pickup truck and chooses to walk a different path, that is a good action. That's a good choice. But it's not just one choice. You've got to keep making those good choices and striving to make those good choices, and recognizing when you've made bad choices that you've made those bad choices and doing your best to make amends and putting those bad choices right, in order to actually have a good, well-formed conscience. Conscience is not a one-off decision. It is something that unfolds over your lifetime, and you need to constantly keep safeguarding. And Miguel Hernandez is a classic object lesson in this movie of that truth, because clearly he has not safeguarded his conscience. Yes, he has walked away from that group of evil men who did this evil and barbaric thing and forced him to participate in it, but it has not saved him, because he has not, clearly not, over the subsequent period of months, continued to safeguard his conscience, and he has, in fact, still been corrupted, and in a major way. Now, what's interesting, though, is that Alejandro is the one who is waiting for him there at the end of that film in that food court. Now, that food court is a kind of interesting place in that mall. It features several times in the story, and I don't know if this is intentional or not, but for me, it very much actually speaks to the symbolism of the church, which is a place of morality and moral law. Why does it speak to me of the church? Well, because of the fact that it is symbolic of a church, this food court, this little Mexican cantina. It's a place where you come to break bread, which is the core reason for Christian liturgy and Christians to attend church on Sunday, is they come together for the breaking of bread. And so that's why you go to this place. And it's also the place where Miguel, at the end of the film, encounters the risen one, quote unquote, who is Alejandro. Now, I'm not trying to suggest for a second that Alejandro represents Christ in any kind of way, because clearly this is quite a bit that's different here, but there is that whole idea of death, resurrection, and sort of him being like the risen one who is scarred, but is now risen to a new life. And Miguel meets him in that place. So for me, there's powerful symbolism, whether it's intended or not, that speaks of the church. That's just an interesting sort of side note. But the point is that Alejandro encounters Miguel there. He's waiting for him there. And what's fascinating, and this is actually a moment of hope, It might kind of seem like a dark moment, but it's a moment of hope. It's a moment of ambiguity, as I said, because we don't know now who or what Alejandro represents. Has he been transformed? Is he the same man? Or is he someone new? We don't quite know yet. But what's interesting is the real hope for me that I see in that scene is Miguel Hernandez and his response to seeing Alejandro. Because what is Alejandro? Alejandro is the embodiment of that act of evil that he committed out in that desert when he shot and killed him. And how does Miguel Hernandez respond when he is confronted by this ghost of his past, if you like? Alejandro is the embodiment of this very vile act of evil that he first perpetrated there. And when he is caught up in this moment of encounter again with that act of evil, he is convicted. And it calls to him for transformation. And what does he do? He hangs his head in shame. He doesn't fight back. He doesn't ignore. He is not ambivalent. He is not blasé. And that would be the sign of a conscience that has been so badly malformed, there is no longer any light there at all. But the way, in fact, that he responds shows that he knows and he is reminded. And when he sees Alejandro, he is convicted for what he has done. And that's actually really hopeful because it means that his conscience is still alive in there. That the flicker of flame of his conscience, his moral conscience, has come alive again. How this will all play out, who knows? But it's still a profoundly important moment. Our third and final character who undergoes a trial of conscience is the character of Matt Graver. And for Matt Graver, both Alejandro and Isabel Reyes are the spark. They are the spark which calls his conscience into life. And Matt Graver is a man he's different from Alejandro. Alejandro, as I talked about before, was a character who has a justification, if you like, for the corruption that has overtaken his conscience. He was the victim of a cruel and inhumane act of barbarism on the part of the cartels. And so you can understand how someone who has been victimized in that way would have their conscience corrupted. But Matt Graver doesn't have that excuse, or not as far as we know. Matt Graver is someone who actually seems to relish and enjoy doing this and who has no real justification for being the way that he is in this particular film. But it's Alejandro, as I said, and Isabel who are the spark and that bring his conscience back to life. And we see this so powerfully starting to unfold. First of all, when he's asked to go and actually kill them and to take his team back and clean up the mess that they've made, if you like, and just to assassinate everyone, you can see he's troubled by that, but he's still willing to do it. He's going to do it. But then on the way there, before they can get there, Alejandro is killed by Miguel Hernandez before they have a chance to get there and do the job themselves. And Steve, and the character of Steve is a character whose conscience has been really badly corrupted. He's a whole nother story that we could spend probably a whole nother video talking about. But he makes that statement, "I'm glad we didn't have to do that." And then he asks Matt, what about the girl? Because obviously the girl is still alive. What do we do about this girl? Now, it's interesting, Steve's comment, I'm glad we didn't have to do that. He's not really speaking from a place of sorrow that someone who supposedly was their friend has been brutally murdered. He's speaking from a place of selfishness. Wow, I would have done that, but I'm glad I didn't have to, because, that saves me a job, having to get my hands dirty. Someone else did it for me. It's actually quite reprehensible when you think about that comment and what it really symbolizes and what it means. And then, of course, he asks Matt, what about the girl? And Matt stares in silence. And this is important because this obviously is just powerful symbolism that points to contemplation. He is really now being convicted in his conscience about what is going on here. And he's asked then, what are the rules of engagement? And he says, wipe it clean. Now, the first time I watched that film, the only thing I really saw in that statement, wipe it clean, was kill them all. But then you realize there's actually a double meaning here. There's more going on here. Wipe it clean is actually a very well-chosen phrase on the part of Taylor Sheridan to put into the mouth of Matt Graver. Because wipe it clean can mean, yes, just assassinate everyone, get rid of a problem, kill everyone. But what we discover is, what I think he's really saying is, not clean the scene or clean up our mess, but we need to clean our conscience. Our conscience is dirty. Our conscience needs cleaning and needs to be wiped clean here, not our actions. And why do I think that? Well, because what happens immediately after him telling them all to wipe it clean is that he goes and saves the girl, which is a decision clearly he's made while they were on the way there. It's not something that just happens in an instant. He's clearly already made that decision. And to me, that speaks to that whole idea of getting his conscience clean, of repentance, of putting right the evil that he has been involved in. And he saves Isabel Reyes. Now, there is a profoundly important scene that takes place in the helicopter after that when they are flying away. And I love this because it's so well done. Yet the profundity of this scene is really, really important. So Isabel Reyes is staring at him and he starts to stare back. Now, this is important because Isabel Reyes is basically, she is the embodiment of Matt Graver's convicted conscience. She is the embodiment of the evil that he has willingly been going along with and participating in. She reminds him of Alejandro. She speaks to him of this whole scenario, everything that he's been caught up in. She is his convicted conscience, and she is staring at him. What's interesting is she's staring at him as if she knows the whole story. But when you think about this film, she doesn't know the whole story. There are big chunks of the story and the people and the players in the story that she doesn't know anything about. She's very ignorant of the facts, in fact, when you think about her in relation to this film and in the story. But she's staring at him as if she knows everything. Why? Because she is symbolic in that moment of his convicted conscience. Because Matt Graver does know everything. His conscience knows everything, and his conscience in the scene is staring back at him to remind him of everything. Now, this is the profound moment of hope. He cannot look at her. He has to look away. That, again, is another hopeful moment. Because if Matt Graver was to look at Isabel and just to keep staring her down and not look away, that would tell me that his conscience is dead. There is no light in there at all inside him flickering away. His conscience has been so badly seared that he's become a psychopath, that he could stare back with a soulless indifference as his own conscience calls to him and says that what you've done is evil and what you've been doing is evil. If he could stare back at that with total indifference, he's become a psychopath. His conscience is totally corrupted. The flame is dead. But he can't. He has to look away. And the reason he has to look away is because he knows that this isn't right. And he can no longer stare back with this cold indifference. This film, as I said, is actually really, really important. And the message that lies at the heart of the story, as I said, it's much different to the first film, which just puts the question out there. This film very clearly attempts to answer the question. And I think the heart of the story, and why I think it's so very important, is that what it's really saying is here, the morality tale in this film is that consequentialism will corrupt your conscience. And it's really about corruption of consciences by consequentialism. Consequentialism is a particular type of utilitarianism. You look at the consequence of an action and you determine the merit of your action based on the consequence, based on the outcome. The end justifies the means, and that's very much what is going on in this film. We have the threat and the grave evil of the cartels and the people smugglers and everything else that's going on, and that has to be responded to in some way. They have to do something. And so what's happened is the US government here has said, well, the end justifies the means. We've got to keep our people safe. And so that justifies us doing anything, including perpetrating our own acts of evil, our own acts which lack virtue, in order to try and secure this good outcome, maximize good in the world for our people. Now, remember before I talked about this whole idea of killing children and how that was really important to the story? Well, what you realize about the story of Sicario 2, Day of the Soldado, is that both sides are actually willing to kill children. Both. the cartels in their corrupt world of vice and evil, they are willing to kill children. They kill that young man simply because he refuses to murder another person. But they're not the only ones who are willing to kill children. So are the guys who are supposed to be the good guys in this movie. They are willing, Matt Graver and his team and those officials and the US government are willing to actually kill Isabel Reyes in order to cover up their mistakes. And it's a very, very important plot point, because what it shows us that the end justifies the means as a form of corruption. It corrupts the good. Because when you're killing children, you are doing something that is gravely immoral. There is no justification to deliberately kill another innocent human being. And when you are deliberately killing children who have a level of vulnerability and innocence, there is just such a serious level of corruption of the good that has gone on here. This is not good, true, and beautiful. When you become a monster to fight a monster, you have lost. And this is really the message that lies at the heart of this film. And it's this idea that if you allow yourself to be corrupted by consequentialism, you can no longer claim the high moral ground. And this isn't just about the question of people smugglers or drug cartels. Like, obviously, one of the big questions or the big issues where this question has really risen in the last decade or so has been in the whole area of terrorism and how do we respond to particularly the threat of Islamic terrorism. Does the end justify the means? Or if we fall into that consequentialism, is not our own conscience corrupted in the process? Have we not actually ended up, rather than defending something that is good, true, and beautiful, have we not actually ended up creating a new world that has been built on a foundation of evil, where the end justifies the means? Because if you start with that as your foundation for this new world, then guess what? It doesn't stop there. It just keeps growing, and that corruption is like a cancerous virus that just spreads throughout the system and finds more and more reasons and more categories of people where it would be okay to do horrible and barbaric things to them because the end justifies the means. And we see even at the end of this film where Matt Graver has chosen to save Isabel Reyes, his conversion is still not complete yet, but there is hope in the fact that he looks away, that he can't stare with cold indifference. And in many ways that is symbolic of society as a whole, and particularly in the West, that not everyone is looking away with cold indifference, that there are these moments or there are groups of people who actually look at these situations and they are convicted by them and they are called to action in some way. Obviously, the first and most important thing, and this is very much at the heart of the story in this film, is that call to action must begin within us. You transform the world by transforming your life first and foremost, your own moral action in the world. And that's very much what we see here. It's a very personal encounter that these three men have with this trial of conscience and how they respond to it. But the key message in this film is that you don't solve the problem of evil by adding more evil to benefit yourself. That is not how you respond to evil. In order to respond to evil and to truly combat evil, you must respond with goodness, truth, and beauty. Now, that doesn't rule out military action. That doesn't rule out policing and all of those kinds of things. But that must always be done from a place of genuine moral goodness, moral truth, and an attempt to safeguard that which is beautiful. It must never ever be something that just devolves into a violent act of barbarism where you meet barbarism with another new form of barbarism of your own, because that's a short-term solution, but it's not a long-term one. You end up creating a brave new corrupted world, and that corrupted world will spread its cancerous tentacles. Not only that, but you also end up creating a world where you are simply likely to amplify the problems that you are trying to deal with. So the whole idea, particularly when you think about terrorism, of radicalization, how is radicalization fostered? Well, it is fostered when you go into a country and you do evil things to try and deal with evil. What happens? people who would otherwise not normally be radicalized are caught up in that evil, and often they become victims of it in their own families and people they know and love. And so what happens? They become radicalized as a result. So it is not a long-term solution. It is not a good solution. And I mean that in the true sense of the word good. It is not good, true, and beautiful. And this movie really, really powerfully presents that message, I think. Unlike the first film, which just asked the question, this one really attempts, I think, to give a much stronger answer. So where to from here? How do you wrap up this trilogy? Now, I read an article recently which was suggesting that the producers want Kate Mercer to come back. They want Emily Blunt to come back and to reprise her role as Kate Mercer for the third film in this trilogy. My response to that is no. I don't think they should do that. I think Kate Mercer, to me, that would be a huge mistake. It would corrupt, if you like, the arc or the way in which this trilogy is unfolding. To go back to Kate Mercer would be, in my mind, would be an odd thing to do. I don't know. Maybe Taylor Sheridan, who is a very talented scriptwriter, can see a way to do that, which wouldn't just be very cliched. And it wouldn't feel forced and wrong. But for my way of thinking, I can't see why you'd bring her back. It seems to me to be going back to a story that has moved on now. If I was Taylor Sheridan, what I'd be looking to do is I would be looking to create a trilogy that's almost like a 3-act play. And in the first act with Sicario, we have the introduction of this concept of the end justifies the means and these sort of key players. Then in the second act, we begin to delve into this, what the action of living out this consequentialism actually looks like in the real world. When you start living this stuff out, what happens? What is required of the people who want to participate in this consequentialism? And what are the fruits of that? And then in the third and final film, what I would do is I would show the sort of long-term fruition, the fruit of what happens when you build a world on consequentialism. So what I would do is I would set up those younger players. I would set up Isabel Reyes, and I would have her along with Miguel, and even, remember from the first film, Silvio, who is the police officer, the Mexican police officer, he's killed at the end of the film. He's the guy who's at the entrance to the tunnel unloading those drugs when Alejandro emerges from the tunnel and then hijacks his car. And he forces him to pursue Manuel Diaz. And then as in that process of pursuing Manuel Diaz, he is shot and killed by Alejandro. Well, Silvio, and remember his son, who he's always... The son is always coming to see him in the morning in this sort of humble little family home that he lives in, and he wants to play soccer with him, and then at the very end, his dad is not there. And I would have Silvio's son, I would have Miguel, I would have Isabel, I would have those characters, and I would now bring them into this world and show the potential fruits of what happens when you build a world of consequentialism. And I would show it like the third act, the third and final film would be this playing out in this new generation and what it looks like to create this world and how this is not a good thing because it just keeps perpetuating a really bad cycle. That's just me, though. But Taylor Sheridan is such a talented screenwriter that I'm sure he's going to write a far better version of this film that I could even imagine. And quite frankly, I'm now really looking forward to the completion of this trilogy. And for me, it is going to be one of the most unique and important trilogies that has been put to film in the modern era. Because it's just been so very, very well crafted. As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please let me know what you think in the comments section below. And if you like the content I'm creating, please consider supporting the channel. The adpocalypse is really biting in a big way, and I've noticed all sorts of analytics on my channel that are just now getting smashed to pieces because of these changes at YouTube, and it's not good. So if you'd like to support the channel, you can leave a tip in the tip jar. There's a PayPal link below, or you can become a regular subscriber on Patreon or Subscribestar. The links for how to do that are found below. Thanks for watching, and a huge thank you to everyone who is already supporting the channel. I'll see you next time on Left Foot Media.